Good evening to our Melbourne audience, and very good morning to those joining us from Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe and beyond, and very, very early in the morning in the case of one of our panelists who's joining us from Texas. My name is Julie Fedor, and I'll be chairing this event. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, and which the University of Melbourne stands. And I would like to pay respect to elders of the Kulin Nation, past and present and emerging, and also to extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians in the audience. Thank you all so much for coming along to this webinar. So this is the first in a series of 4 webinars that we'll be holding this year under the title Ukraine Writes Back, Writers, Poets and the War. And this first session is titled Names on the Maps, and it will feature 2 wonderful writers and poets and scholars, Oksana Lutsyshyna and Oksana Maksymchuk, in conversation with Marko Pavlyshyn, Professor Emeritus at Monash University. And I will be chairing this session in my capacity as one of the conveners of the University of Melbourne's Arts Faculty Research Initiative on Post-Soviet Space, which is co-hosting this event together with our partner, the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand. And this is an event that really means a lot to all of the team involved in organising and hosting it. We really are so delighted to be able to provide another platform for amplifying Ukrainian voices, for helping to keep this war at the forefront of people's minds and on the scholarly agenda. And we're very excited at this opportunity to share and discuss some of the really extraordinary and extraordinarily powerful poetry that's been created by Ukrainian poets today. A couple of quick housekeeping matters. We will encourage members of the audience to ask questions of the panelists, and you can submit your questions at any time throughout the session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be collecting those and feeding them back to the panelists at the end of the session. So the last half hour or so of the webinar will be devoted to answering your questions. And I should mention also that we are recording this event with a view to potentially publishing it online too. So I'm going to keep this introduction very short. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Marko Pavlyshyn, who will be running the main part of the session, and who is somebody who really does need no introduction for anybody with an interest in Ukrainian literature and culture. It's no exaggeration to say that Professor Pavlyshyn has been the driving force behind Ukrainian studies in Australia, as most, if not all of you will be aware, and he's also been a hugely influential voice across Ukrainian studies internationally. He's had a long, prolific career as a distinguished scholar of Ukrainian literature and culture with achievements too numerous to list here, but I would like to draw your attention in particular to the fact that he's the author, most recently, of the book Ukrainian Literature, A Wartime Guide for Anglophone Readers, that came out just last month in Professor Mark Edelay's Cambridge Elements series, and you can read an excerpt online on the Cambridge University Press website. And if you do, I'm sure that taste of the book will whet your appetite to obtain a copy of the book in its entirety. Marko has been very much the driving force also behind this webinar series, initiating it and shaping it. And indeed, he has been a key figure who has made it possible for us to start to develop Ukrainian studies here at the University of Melbourne, which we're all really thrilled about, and hugely fortunate to have Professor Pavlyshyn working together with us so generously and tirelessly on these shared endeavours, in addition to all the other many other projects to which he devotes his time and his energy. So let me hand over to you now, Marko, to introduce our panellists and to host this conversation before I come back for the Q&A for the last part, which we are aiming to start around 6 p.m. or so Melbourne time.
Julie, thank you very much indeed for that more than generous introduction. Let me also begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking, and by paying my respects to their elders, past and present. And in similar spirit, I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land of Ukraine, who today courageously defend their country against colonial predation, dispossession, and the genocidal threat of extinction of their identity. Now, Ukraine Writes Back, which is the title of our series, is not an accidental name. It alludes to the title of a classical work of Australian humanities scholarship, The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures, authored by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin, which appeared way back in 1989. Now, that title, of course, referred to an article by Salman Rushdie, who in turn was jokingly modifying the title of the 1980 science fiction film in the Star Wars series, The Empire Strikes Back. Now, the perspective on culture, which The Empire Writes Back helped initiate, showed up the way in which literature often serves to reinforce through culture the power of politically and economically dominant centers. But post-colonial studies also foregrounded how colonially subjugated cultures could resist colonialism and fight against the marginalization and erasure that dominant imperial cultures inflicted upon them. The modern history of Ukraine, of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian literature, can be seen as a history of such resistance to colonialism. And through our webinar series, we hope to listen to and learn from some of the Ukrainian poets and writers who are engaged in writing back to the neo-colonial aggressor of today. Now, this morning, we're very fortunate to be speaking to two important Ukrainian language writers and poets who have contributed a great deal to the visibility of Ukrainian literature in the English-speaking countries, Oksana Lutsyshyna and Oksana Maksymchuk. Now, names on the maps is a quotation or a near quotation from Oksana Maksymchuk's poem Cherry Orchard, which was published in her English language collection Still City, which came out last year. Now, Still City has now been long-listed this year for the very prestigious Griffin Poetry Prize. And Oksana Maksymchuk calls herself a bilingual Ukrainian-American poet, scholar, and literary translator. And she's the author of two award-winning poetry collections in Ukrainian, Ksenia and Love. She's co-editor with Max Rosochinsky of the very well-known anthology Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine, which came out in 2017. And Dr. Oksana Maksymchuk has co-translated several poetry collections and is the recipient, among other distinctions, of the Modern Language Association's Salione Prize for a Literary Translation, which happened last year. Now, Oksana Lutsyshyna is a Ukrainian writer, translator, and poet, author of 3 novels, a collection of short stories, and 5 books of poetry, including Persephone Blues, which has been published in English. Now, for her most recent novel, Ivan and Phoebe, Oksana Lutsyshyna was awarded first the Lviv City of Literature UNESCO Prize in 2020, and in the following year, the Taras Shevchenko National Award in Fiction. Now, this is Ukraine's most prestigious literary award. It's a very significant form of recognition. And Ivan and Phoebe too is now available in English, beautifully translated by Nina Murray. Now, Dr. Oksana Lutsyshyna teaches Ukrainian Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. And in Austin, it is 2:15 in the morning, and I want to say how very grateful we are that Oksana Lutsyshyna has joined us at this quite unfriendly hour.
Thank you.
Now, when we were preparing for this webinar, we agreed that our guests would read some of their poems in English, either in special blocks that we'll set aside for this, or just in conversation when the context makes it appropriate. And perhaps they'll also choose to read one of their poems in Ukrainian. So I'd like to begin by asking both of our guests how the war, and by the war I mean the war in its initial phase that began in 2014, and then the escalated war that started with the full-scale invasion in February 2022, how the war has affected their writing. For example, has it imposed upon them a sense of obligation to write only about the war, or to write only things that in one way or another relate to the war, pushing out all other contents? And has it influenced Oksana and Oksana? Has it influenced the literary forms that you've chosen? Has it influenced the media that you've chosen through which to distribute and make known your work? And as you respond, I hope you might illustrate the points that you make with a poem. Oksana Lutsyshyna, would you like to speak first?
Of course. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And it's such a great company to talk about poetry with and to read poetry too. So I would say definitely. And first of all, it changes the form. It's quite characteristic of me to write rhymed poetry. But after the war started, a lot of my poetry became unrhymed to sort of match this reality that doesn't rhyme with itself. And again, that may not be true for every poet, because some people write more, free verses from the start, so it doesn't have to be that way. And my second observation would be that it definitely changed all the metaphors that I have used. It's kind of also characteristic to use this very Ukrainian set of metaphoric poetry, to talk about love in a particular way, to compare, love to war, which again is quite a prominent theme, or used to be in Ukrainian poetry of the past years. And suddenly it all made no sense anymore, because you cannot talk about, somebody's bleeding heart in a metaphoric sense if you know that it actually happens in reality now. So it's you have to really choose your words differently and basically think about details that are not so abstract. So I think it just makes poetry more concrete, if that makes sense.
I wonder whether that changed sense of tact, there being things that you can't say in a traditional way anymore, whether that's something that you've experienced too, Oksana Maksymchuk?
Thanks. I guess I come out of about 10 years of actually reading a lot of war poetry. So as Oksana knows, because her poems were included in the anthology that we co-edited with my husband, Max, who is from Crimea. And when the annexation took place and then the first incursions into Donbass were happening, we started looking on the social media and seeing that a lot of poets are responding in real time. Some of the poets were from the region, but there were a lot of poets who were kind of witnessing the unfolding events on the screen, in newspapers, often in chats with friends from the region or relatives from the areas that were affected. And a lot of these were kind of like transcriptions of these conversations. So it was very much like couched in the docu-poetry tradition. And that really also changed the idiom, the syntax, the grammar, and as Oksana is saying, also the more artistic devices like the poetic tropes, the metaphors, the way that metonymy works. And there were many different strategies, but some that I think were very interesting, that were maybe quite literary and reminiscent of the avant-garde, were the fragmentation and decomposition. And also there were these kinds of alienated childish babblings, where the voice became infantile and kind of out of control and unrecognizable and strange in the context of this new experience. So when I started putting together my own collection, I kind of had that whole background in mind and really the enormous chorus of voices. And I was thinking about, given that I'm going to write it in English, how do I kind of pitch my voice to contribute to that? And I've also learned from all of them in various ways. So for me, it was an attempt to keep a diary, but at the same time to journal this experience, not of a private person really, or a civilian, as much as really a civilian poet who is observing these changes in language and discourse, and in consciousness really that are taking place during the war, and is trying to make a poetic record of them.
I'm wondering, are there now things that you used to write, or themes that you used to explore, which the war has made somehow irrelevant, or has pushed aside, made it more somehow inappropriate to talk about in the presence of the suffering and dispossession and displacement and death of war?
Oksana, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure.
Because I have things to say too.
Yeah. Oh, you can go ahead and I'll follow if you have.
You go ahead.
We'll
ahead. Do the turns. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sounds good. So, yes and no. I think poetry is a very tricky thing. If something needs to be said, it will find a way to be said. And some things are really, I guess, still transcendent, even though it is hard to believe. And it is probably not even politically correct to say that. But the problem with war is that it has shaped human experience for so many centuries, unfortunately. We don't like that human experience that we all share, but it's there. And if we're talking about a place like Eastern Europe, a place like Ukraine, then we can probably say that some wars in Ukraine just never really ended. It's a continuous state of war since, at least 300 years or so. And even if we think about World War II, we would like to imagine that it ended, but somehow it never really did, because there were so many things that didn't have closure. There were so many families that didn't have closure, that it kind of persists with generations. So in that sense, I should say that a certain set of topics is always with us, a certain disquiet, a certain remembrance of the dead, if I were to say it that way. And in my particular case, I usually tap into some kind of mythological thing. Usually Greek mythology shapes some of my poems, sometimes other mythologies. And so that's what I mean when I say transcendent. So because yeah, it's still different, because just like Oksana said, there's a certain decomposition that's happening in the reality around us. So we cannot really necessarily beautify it as much.
Oksana? The other Oksana, are we? Oh, we may have we perhaps lost the other Oksana?
No, is this the connection?
Possibly.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I do have flimsy connection, I think, because Turkish internet is very, very controlled. So what I was going to say was that in this kind of key poem in Lyubomir Yakimchuk's Apricots of Donbass decomposition, which bears witness to this fragmentation on the level of names of cities, actually. The destruction of cities being depicted also as a kind of destruction of lettering and the grammatical structures that make life in these cities possible. And she says that there is this accusatory tone that you write poetry about war beautiful as embroidery. There is no poetry about war, only letters remain, and they all make a single sound. Rrr. So it's imitating the sound of machine guns and artillery, and I guess at that point, maybe also maybe not the missiles yet, but basically sounds of destruction. And I think 10 years into the war, I have come to think that beauty is really important in war poetry, that we have to preserve and heal the beautiful in the poems themselves as well, and on the level of language itself. So I think for me, a lot of it is actually resisting the fragmentation and coming back to euphony and to something that resembles a rhyme and metaphor and beautiful images. Because I think we can really get accustomed. I think, when war first happens, you have to bear witness to it appropriately, but eventually you also have to clean up the rubble and continuously do it even as the war goes on, because there has to be a commitment to life and to all of the things that make life worth living, like the ornamental things even. And I think it's also true in these war contexts that love is very important. And it's not the case in which, you write about love and then you write about war as a way of writing about love. It's rather writing about wartime in a way that reveals the full spectrum of the human experience. War is extremely human. Violence is extremely human. All of the terrible things we do to each other are extremely human. And one way in which we can balance it out is to also talk about other extremely human things we do, which is to care for each other and heal each other. And there is a lot of that going on in the war context as well. So one of the reasons why it's so exciting and why it feels so intense to be in Ukraine right now during the war, why I go regularly, is because there is this immense spirit of solidarity and love and commitment to each other that you can just kind of sense on the bodily level. And I think that it's important for poetry to reflect that as well.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful and in some ways consoling to hear that in spite of the horrible caesura that the war has inserted into human life, yet there are ways in which poetry continues to do what poetry has always done, to write about the eternal, transcendent themes, to celebrate love, for example. Actually, I think this may be a good moment for our first bracket of readings, perhaps, again, since we're maintaining an alternation between Oksana Lutsyshyna and Oksana Maksymchuk. Over to you, Oksana, perhaps, well, when you read, perhaps a few words of introduction about the poems and then the poems themselves. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Since we're talking about both sides of human experience here, the humans that are violent creatures and produce war, but also the humans that can love, I can read a few poems that can kind of illustrate both of these tendencies. So the first one is titled "Eastern Europe is a Pit of Death," and it was written in Ukrainian but translated into English by Olena Jennings. Eastern Europe is a pit of death and decaying plums. I hide from it in the body of America, but sooner or later I'll slip from that light back down into that other, and we'll start talking about death, because this is our national sport, talking about death, sad yet beautiful, hoping that the world will hear us and gasp at the beauty and sadness. My lover spreads my fingers with his own. He was educated in good old France, then America. He also studied Buddhism and erotica somewhere near the borders of Thailand. It's good to drink wine with him and chat. But not about death or Eastern Europe, because the world's a shithole and it's worthwhile to learn only one art, that of hopping from one pleasure island to another, and not giving a damn about plague-infected continents with their corpse-eating flies. He kisses me goodnight and disappears into his dream, as I lie in mine, full of summer sun and ephemeral sweetness. Mittel Europa, Zbigniew Herbert whispers in my ear. Middle Europe enters a labyrinth without a single turn, a labyrinth of fate and freshly laid brick. It enters and doesn't exit. It endures and revives, small like newly seeded grass in the evening, strong like the grandchildren of those that survived the war. When will I die? Someone asks in my still childish voice, but I don't hear the answer because it suddenly becomes dark in this death pit where Miklos Radnoti is writing his last poem. So, and I will read one that is a little bit more, I dare say, optimistic. It's about my grandma. And it's also translated by Olena Jennings. My grandma Katerina mowed the lawn every day for the rabbits, danced every day in the kitchen and in the garden, and still went to work as a guard, watching over some kind of factory, and during her night shifts embroidered towels and napkins. You couldn't scare her when my grandpa locked the gates and doors, yelling, "Go sleep in the street." She took out a secret ladder and climbed into the house through the window, waited in the garden alone among the sleepy plants. My grandma Katerina carried such big love that when that love surfaced, totalitarian regimes scrambled every which way. The no-good drunk men, all kinds of dirt and uncleanliness. It's not a joke that fear itself fell down, being afraid. The pots in the kitchen became still. The air brightened. The curtains swayed in the wind, so the neighbors were amazed. How can this be? An ordinary life for an ordinary woman. This Katerina can do anything. The Lord God speaks with her voice. When she was dying, she didn't ask what's next. She only asked, "How are my children? Will my children be without a mother?" And even now, the only place in the world where I am not afraid to be is in her presence, even if only in memories. This Katerina can do anything. The Lord God speaks in her voice. So, and to finish this block, I am going to read another one, and this one is more along the lines of, so to say, decomposition of language. So it's kind of trying to imagine the life as it has become because of the escalation. So this one was actually translated by Oksana Maksymchuk and Max Roschinsky. He asks, "Don't help me, help the soldiers. I don't need anything anymore, neither medicine, nor heat, nor light, nor a drink of water. The room I am leaving is not this one, but the room of my body. They say that God doesn't exist, that the one that exists is human. But as a human, can he exist? Is his existence necessary? They say that I am at the end of my life, but I still don't understand anything. Last night, it hurt so bad that I forgot everything, even who I was. No heaven, no blessed darkness. All I saw were soldiers. I felt their thirst in my bones. Don't come to help me. Help those who still want to make children." Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Two of those poems I followed in the text of Persephone Blues, this lovely collection, beautifully published. Oksana Maksymchuk, your turn.
Thanks so much, and it's an honor to be reading with Oksana, which, you know, every time I hear her read, it's the impression is refreshed. I'll be reading from this collection, the Still City Diary of an Invasion, that was published last year, and I started working on poems for this collection mainly in 2022, awaiting the invasion. I was not thinking that the invasion would actually happen. So I was hoping it would be a kind of book of a non-event, an anticipation building up and kind of tension diffusing by nothing actually happening. But it turned out to be a very different type of collection, and I continued working on it after we left Ukraine and lived in 5 different countries that year, and then settled down in Warsaw, which was a very interesting place, I think, to continue working on it, because it was a place that had been pretty much completely razed and then had been rebuilt in the past half century. So it's kind of a vision into the future for many of Ukrainian cities as well. And the first poem it could be one of the first that I wrote. It's called Intimate Relationship. I bought a hat of fall mink fur to wear in the war. In my hat I sit in my cellar, waiting. The enemy's late. I read his messages on my phone, popping open jars of strawberry jam lining the cellar walls. Like a lover, my enemy sends me flowers, emojis, words of condolence, supplications, doctored screenshots, explicit photos. Reversals. A shirt turned inside out retains the shape of a torso, matching it in form. A home turned inside out, not a skeleton, but a pile of rubble, brought by gravity to a resting point. A body turned inside out is a spectacle, resembling a bag spilling its private content. A mountain turned inside out is still a mountain. Several circles. What I see is an eye, while you're seeing a female breast, purple nipple on top like a cherry. Stubbornly phenomenal, circles join, overlap, sending each mind on its own lonely journey. So Kandinsky and Klaas sat in each other's lap for a little while in a house they shared in Dessau, as outside the frame yet another shape shed its flesh, exposing the blackened spine of a rising, inverted star. Here, beloved, taste my eyeball, rinsed in a special cocktail only I can craft in my mortal body. Still life of a person with a pug. She was walking her pug down the street in a town where she spent her childhood and teenage years, still in her winter coat, even though it was getting warmer and the buds on the poplars grew engorged. Something bit her in the back, and she fell and lay there on the sidewalk. The next day, a neighbor brought out a sheet with tiny roses for that which was once her body, a matching pillowcase for the pugs. A passerby took a photograph and posted it on Telegram, causing an avalanche of angry emojis. Water under the bridge. No more bridge now, but the river flows as it did before, like a single tear rolls down the face of the landscape, tears through the terrain laid out for it by another tear and another before it. Doesn't grieve when the towns clustered along its banks lie in ruins. Doesn't weep cradling the corpses, toying with the remains. Indiscriminate like a poem's flow, reflecting everything, changing nothing. Drone footage. When a shell strikes a person, there is a scattering, resembling a flock of birds taking off, hands flying in the air, signaling, feet levitating in mid-kick. Their avian shapes casting shadows, lithe and carefree from on high. And the last one I'll read in this set, Rocket in the Room. What the rocket has in common with the room full of children is its current location. Somebody thought the rocket belonged in the room with children, and now it's here. In time, someone else will come and collect the pieces of the rocket and of the children, weeping and shouting insults at the sky. But for now, this rocket and these children are an unsorted matter, a puzzle awaiting a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana, for those poems, some of which are confronting in their imagery, and all of them reflecting, I think, the profundity of shock and grief and horror. Thank you. Thank you both for these readings, which were, of course, in English. Oksana, Lutsyshyna, I think yours were all translated, and Oksana Maksymchuk, yours were originally written in English, if I'm right. Yeah. So I'd like to ask you to focus now on the question of Ukrainian literature in other languages. Oksana, Lutsyshyna, your two of your novels, I mean, Love Life and Ivan and Phoebe, have appeared in English, and you are active as a translator. Oksana Maksymchuk, you are an award-winning literary translator. Can you both talk a little about the importance of translation for a literature and culture like the Ukrainian one? its importance in general, but its importance at this time of war in particular. And I might ask, as you reflect on this, how your own choices of texts for translation have been guided. What was it about war that made you choose this text to translate and not that one? Oksana, Lutsyshyna.
Sure. Well, I think we have a daunting task ahead of us. We have to show to the world who we are. It's been such a long time that the world didn't really know what we are. Even if it knew this place on the map, even if some people knew that this is a country completely separate from Russia and so on and so forth, people didn't really know it because there was no way for us in that situation of, colonial domination, cultural colonialism, and so on to assert ourselves in this collective imagination. And, now we have to actually do that, I believe. We have to make the world associate something with us, something that they would immediately know that, okay, this is a Ukrainian, this character is Ukrainian, this film is Ukrainian, this book is Ukrainian, and so on and so forth. We have been marginalized by the world literary process that depended on world political process. So translating our literature has become our, main task right now, because this is one of the most important means of communicating this. And, translating literature in the times of war adds to this importance, because how else are we going to let the world see what's going on? People are so used to the news, they're so tired of the news that whenever they just see this line saying like so-and-so were killed in a city so-and-so, they just don't want to go into it. But literature brings it to us in a different level. It actually activates our empathy. It activates a very different kind of response. So we need to have that there. And as for Ukrainian literature that I, would consider choosing for translating, Olena Jennings and I translated Artem Cheikh's war memoir. And it's called Absolute Zero, and also a collection of poems by Ukrainian poet Katerina Kalitko. And it seems that documentary prose and poetry are right now the main genres. It's probably not reasonable to expect, long novels about this particular war. This will happen after the war, most likely. So people are just documenting what they see. It's a lot of literature of witnessing. So, and this literature definitely needs to be translated so that the world would see what's going on.
Yeah, literature is witnessing at this point. Oksana?
So I think for a really long time, there has been so little translation from Ukrainian language, maybe since the time of independence until pretty much about 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, when we were submitting a proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we said, please sponsor the project. One of our arguments was that in the US, there hadn't been a publication of a collection of poems from Ukrainian in translation for the past 15 years. So since maybe 2001. And I know that, in Australia, there has been activity, and in Canada, maybe nothing much happening in the UK. But usually if a book is available in one market, it doesn't mean it will automatically be disseminated in another market. Maybe a library would get it, but it's usually extremely sparse. And because we focus primarily on poetry, it's also a really limited niche market. So I can't really congratulate ourselves like we are doing so much for Ukrainian culture by translating this work, because there is not really an audience for poetry to begin with. It's really more of, something we do to sustain ourselves and to make this work available for the people who may already be interested in it. Right before the war, in the year 2020, when did the war start? 2022? Yeah.
Well, the full-scale invasion, yes? Mm.
Yeah, the full scale. Yeah, so this is one of the defense mechanisms, the desire not to know and not to remember. I keep forgetting that it's been 3 years, and it started in 2022. In fact, the 2021 was the year of awaiting it. And in 2021, our anthology, which was the major collection of Ukrainian poetry in translation available at that time, sold 18 copies. So after the full-scale invasion, it was featured by the New York Times and the Times and the Paris Review and various other journals. But it took it basically 5 years and the full-scale invasion to rise to the top of attention. And if not for that, it would not have risen to this attention. So there is this uncomfortable truth about it that Ukraine is being paid attention to because of the imperiled state. And at the same time, because attention is being paid, we do need to, this is an opportunity for us as a culture, as Oksana is saying, to present ourselves, to show work. So currently there are many, many more people working on translation than there had been. Even in 2021, there are a lot of native speakers of English who have attempted to learn Ukrainian, many of them who knew another Slavic language, like Russian, for instance, and then started taking classes in Ukrainian and expanding. And I think those are all wonderful transformations, but there is also a fear that that will not last, that lasts only as long as the moment lasts. And so when attention is diverted to another political crisis, that will also mean that fewer translations will be produced in the future. And so the long novels, for instance, that Oksana is talking about, who knows if they will get translated because the moment may have passed for them. So this is a moment of great opportunity, but also something that may well cement our reputation as a country that produces work of a particular genre. And I see this with myself too. I write poems that are not about the war, but nobody wants my non-war poems. The only poetry that gets published, that the journals pick up, that the editors pay attention to, are my war poems. So we are very much being essentialized and reduced to this one experience. There are other people other than Oksana who have, wonderful things to say about erotic love, for instance. But Oksana is really the one who has experience of the war, and so she'll be the one talking about it. So I think a lot of us writers from that context have a similar experience and will be basically dealing with that for the rest of our lives, potentially, that we will not be really allowed to expand. And what applies to us as individual writers may apply to literature as a whole, that we will become war literature, and there will be very little interest in other things that come out of our culture that don't have to do with war, because other cultures write about those things too.
Yeah, well, I hope that a more optimistic future awaits Ukrainian literature, that it won't, in fact, end up being known in the rest of the world only as a poetry and a short prose of war, that there will be works of all genres, and that this moment which the two Oksanas are seizing in order to make Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian writing visible, that this moment will reverberate rather than dissipate and be replaced by silence. We're talking about the distance between two languages. I mean, we're creating in Ukrainian and creating and translating into English. I'd like, as we move towards the end of our discussion, to ask you about a different kind of distance, the physical distance that you must experience as writers who spend much of their time, perhaps most of their time now, outside of Ukraine. In your biographical note, Oksana Lutsyshyna, you call yourself a Ukrainian writer. Oksana Maksymchuk, you call yourself an Ukrainian American writer, which is an interesting distinction. I'd like to ask each of you how you position yourselves relative to Ukraine and to places which are not Ukraine, how this standpoint, both outside and proximate, influences your writing, and how it also influences the way that you are understood and received in Ukraine itself. Oksana Lutsyshyna.
That's a tricky question. I position myself as a Ukrainian writer because I primarily write in Ukrainian. I do write in English, but mostly essays, not necessarily fiction or poetry. I mean, I try once in a while to do that, but not yet full scale, and I don't know if I ever will. And I think this position of an insider and outsider is actually very liberating, because you can see and name things that is very difficult to name and see from within the culture. And I remember what it's like to be inside the culture and to actually struggling to, dismantle something that you don't like. And I mean that epistemologically, not necessarily in any physical way. And as for reception, well, that's another interesting question and very interesting dimension, because in such situation, you're often misunderstood by your native culture. And just like Oksana said, in an American culture, one is often seen just as a kind of like a token Ukrainian writer. It's like, we have a Ukrainian writer here, and they're going to talk about some, Ukrainian things. So, but in Ukraine, I do have an audience, but I do know that to many people I come across as somewhat too foreign, and not necessarily because I write something foreign, but simply because I don't live in Ukraine. I remember when I was awarded the Shevchenko National Prize, a friend of mine went to a website where they announced it, and it actually is open to the comments from the public. I did not go there because I knew what I would see there, but he didn't. And what he saw there was mostly kind of like, what is this American professor doing here? Why is she pretending to be a Ukrainian writer, kind of thing? So that happens. I think Ukraine still is in the position of working towards that openness to a more globalized views and more globalized, maybe even market. And I think that did change lately because of the war, because so many people were forced to leave Ukraine and were forced into this experience of immigration.
Thanks, Oksana. Oksana Maksymchuk.
Well, for me, I use Ukrainian American because that's what I am. It's not because I have such a important reputation as an American writer or as a Ukrainian writer. it's just because that's my identity is dual. I moved to the States when I was 15. So I went to high school and college and graduate school, and I still lived for long periods of time in Ukraine. So when I was talking about how I started this collection, Still City, I was living in Lviv in 2021 with my husband and my son was going to a Ukrainian language school. Near the school that I went to, and we had a very kind of, I don't know, Ukrainian settled life. We still keep the apartment in Lviv that I grew up in. So it's a continuity, and at the same time, I'm always navigating this difference. In the US, I feel Ukrainian, and in Ukraine, I feel very American. So I never quite feel at home. And I also kind of, travel a lot. We have a very nomadic life. And as I said, when we were displaced, right before the invasion, we decided to leave 10 days before because we had a child and we were not sure how safe he would be and what it would mean for him to have survived this. We thought there might be ground occupation. And my friend who lived through the siege of Sarajevo, their father was a famous sniper, said, "No, don't stay. Take them out because they'll be dealing with this all of their lives." And so we left and lived in Hungary and in the US and in Austria and in Poland for the rest of the year. And I found that was very fruitful also for the collection and for poetry to be in different places and to kind of dip yourself into these very different contexts and languages and perspectives. And as Oksana was saying, that just having a single perspective can often be stifling. The reason I leave Ukraine and the reason I come back is precisely because I'm trying to get air. And if you are just in one particular context, so many of the contingencies begin to look like necessities. And so many of the things you begin to take for granted, even though they're easily changeable and they can be looked at differently. And for me, this kind of entanglement and disentanglement is a really important feature of the creative life that you really have to be in and at the same time to be out in order to do the work.
Thank you. Thank you both for your quite confessional responses to that last question. And now I think I would like to invite you to read some more poetry, and that will then lead on to the questions and that Julie will moderate. So over to you for the second bracket of readings, Oksana. Lutsyshyna.
Okay, sure. So I will read two poems, keep it short. So to kind of leave the discussion and the reading on a slightly more optimistic note, these will be poems about cats. One of them is actually the poem that was the favorite of Victoria Melina, my friend, and a Ukrainian writer who was killed by a Russian missile in 2023. Whenever I had a reading, she always asked, "Can you please read this, my favorite poem?" So, in her memory, I will do so. And the last poem that I will read will be in Ukrainian, and I will project my screen to show the poem in English to those in the audience who may want to follow. So, this first poem, translated by Olena Jennings. Who is on my side, you ask? Who is on my side? This tree here, as if it could be against you. As if trees could be against people. A whole park of trees, a whole forest, you could say, and all are on your side, all of them. And the cat? Is the cat against you? No, the cat is on your side. This cat and all the world's cats. all on your side, all your army, nimble, yellow-eyed. And God's, yours and others and everyone's in the world, wouldn't they help you? Of course they would. They are on your side. How could they be against you? And that teacher that said thoughts are everything, is he against you? Why waste his time? Of course, he's on your side, on your side. And the sea? What, you think the sea is against you? All its waves and pebbles and beaches, visible and invisible. Everything is for you, don't doubt it, everything, every day and every minute. Do you hear? The sea roars. It says to you, I am on your side, on your side. And music, which of the notes are against you? Which of the melodies? Mozart, rapists, pianists? No, what are you thinking? Everyone is on your side, on your side. And there is no one against you, and there will never be. So love, keep on loving, don't be afraid. And the last one, which is also about a cat. And this one is actually translated by Oksana Maksymchuk, who is here. And I will read it in Ukrainian. Кіт, тато просили, напиши вірша про мене, як я був молодим, як я взагалі був. Грав на гітарі і ганяв на стадіоні м'яча, головою підкидаючи його високо у небо. А потім повертався додому, у квартиру, із запахом манки і суботнього прання, із килимом, прибитим цвяхами до стіни. На килимі чоловік і жінка, виткані червоним, їдуть на чорних конях. Ні, казала тату, я не можу, я не знаю, що про це написати. Це занадто близько, а тому видається несправжнім. Добре, зітхав він і ходив на роботу, міняв фетровий капелюх на футболку, гітару на церковний хор, а футбол на машину. Манку більше не варили, але килим залишився. А потім він перестав просити. Він зрозумів, що я ніколи не напишу про нього. Зате сміявся, у нас є кіт. Напиши про кота, руденького у білих плямах, руденького із білим голосом. Раз уж не буде мене, то хай зостанеться хоч кіт, витканий із повітря. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oksana. Yeah, Oksana Maksymchuk.
Thank you. That was a beautiful reading. So I'll also read two poems near the end of the book. Blank pages, and this one has an epigraph from Hegel. History is not the soil in which happiness grows. The periods of happiness in it are the blank pages of history. In a story of a life, too, happiness is a kind of silence, a lacuna of meaning, a sweet ellipsis. No disruptions, dangerous forks in the road, hard rocks to hurl, thrills that shake to the core. In the blessed lull of unearned, free-falling calm, there are stories to tell, words to form, weaving verses out of faint gusts of wind, susurrating branches, filling the pages with clouds and trees, songbirds calling out of the thicket, shadows settled on a beloved face, things so delicate and so thin, they barely appear on a clear film of a life well lived, each day a rhyme for the previous day, synchronized and ordered. And the last one I'll read is called Approximations. Waking up in a borrowed room, in a body borrowed for a time, in a time borrowed and hardly used, I remember how light my head becomes when the boys overtaking us in the alley tickle me with guns, running them down my spine, then my hip. How I levitate, the force of a scream suppressed, lifting me up and up. And the way it gets dark when strange men pound on my door at night, shouting, "Open up or we'll break it in." Right before the war, I'd wake up in bed dreaming of another bed, body in it exposed, bone by bone, like a radiograph, through a brilliance, an explosion tearing at the membranes that ensconce the sleeper. Close, yet not an exact match, like a rhyme in a poem you compose post-haste, lines blurred by terror. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you very much for the privilege of listening to, and not only to the wonderful poems, but also to the wonderful readings of the poems. And you're both, I think, very much in that wonderful tradition of Ukrainian declamatia, recitation, the performance of verse. So thank you.
Thank you.
And at this point, I hope that Julie Fedor will now return to us and moderate the remainder of the discussion, building on questions that have come in through the Q&A function.
Yes, thank you all so much for that really absorbing and profound discussion, and for those readings, your readings. I'm sure this is going to stay with all of us for some time after this session, and I'm so glad that we agreed to record it, and you, that we decided to record it and you agreed to let us record it, and I hope that we will manage to find a way for it to find the audience that it really deserves. I didn't expect necessarily a conversation about war poetry to be uplifting necessarily, but it really was in moments. Okay, we have 3 questions already that have been submitted. We have about 20 minutes left, so I would encourage everyone in the audience to submit your questions and your comments and thoughts if you like. We may not have time to get to all of them, but we will do our best. And I think the questions that have been submitted so far are addressed at both the Oksanas. I may as well just take them in the order in which they've been submitted. So Kyle Swain firstly asks, when you write poetry in English, how do you view the audience of your writing? And does this change the words you use or the style?
Oksana, I think you should go first, because you do both languages much more than I do.
Thank you. That's a very insightful question, and I definitely wonder about it myself. I do think I write with a person in mind or a group of people, and I add it with a person or a group of people in mind too. And these are usually my first readers. So there is a certain tailoring and adjustment that I do because of the audience itself. And the audience does not overlap the audience of 2 or 3 people, basically, that I'm writing for. But I wouldn't say that, I don't know. You know, the poems are so different. My Ukrainian language poems are extremely different from the English language poems. And in part, it's because the tradition I am engaging with is very different. And I wonder if tradition, if your predecessors, for instance, are an audience too, like maybe in a sense you're writing for the poets who have written before you in that language, and also for the poets that are writing in it now and the poets who will be writing in it in the future. So This is more common, I think, for poetry than for prose. Oksana will be able to speak better about, I think there is something more maybe temporally grounded about the novels, while with the poetry, it's always an attempt to transcend language, transcend the moment, transcend time itself. So it's becoming much more abstract, and that really can dilute your sense of the audience, meaning that it will include no one and everyone at the same time.
Yeah, that was really a very insightful question, like Oksana said, and Oksana provided a very insightful answer. I really like what you said about the tradition. To write in English, you have to know the tradition of writing poetry in English. And even if you read American poets in translation into your own language, that's not going to help you, because that will not really reflect what's going on in the tradition at all. And it's very easy to just start replicating the patterns that exist in Ukrainian poetry writing, and then to, for example, even rhyming. There are poets who rhyme in the English-speaking world, and excellent poets, but many will not. So when you do, this may not necessarily look familiar to many people, and people will wonder, oh, maybe it's not a very serious poetry. Maybe they're just, writing with rhymes to make it sound better, and so on and so forth. So, and as for novels, I do have some experience writing essays or shorter fiction pieces, not terribly long. And I always wonder, that's a very different field. You're right. It's because so many, when we are talking about the English-speaking world, there is no English-speaking world. There are English-speaking worlds. And there are people from so many countries and former colonies that are writing in English and making it their own language, so to say, infusing it with their own meanings, that I suppose there is a place for some, Ukrainians who now write in English as well. Strangely though may it sound.
Thank you both. Let me pass on to a question from Alessandro Achilli, who says, thank you very much to you both. Do you think that translating more classics of Ukrainian literature could be of help against the essentialization of Ukrainian culture as something only linked to war that Oksana Maksymchuk has mentioned? Who would like to take that question first?
I think Oksana would. Maksymchuk. No.
I mean, Oksana, you are a teacher of Ukrainian literature, so I feel like, you have expertise on this and can make predictions. In my view, it's really not about what is available. It's about what people are likely to pay attention to. So you can make a lot of work available and it will not be noticed. I like to remind myself that every year in the English language context, 10,000 new collections of poetry are getting published. And out of them, very few are getting noticed. So it's what we have is an overabundance of work in this genre. And it doesn't mean that there will be more readers of poetry just because there are more producers of poetry books. So to some extent, I think there is going to be saturation of the book market in the Ukrainian sphere as well, at which point there will be diminishing returns. Every new book that is getting published is less and less likely to get an audience because the people who want to read Ukrainian literature already have their book lists full. And I think that doesn't mean that this work shouldn't be translated. It's just that I wonder to what extent it is actually going to help us mitigate the problem. Polish literature has a similar problem. Polish literature coming out of the Second World War. So we are not alone in this predicament. Lots of literatures are reduced in the US and in the English language context to their particular experiences in which they seem to have established expertise through a kind of suffering or victimhood or heroism. And I think there is, there is something to be done about dealing with that and maybe expanding the canon slowly. But at the same time, this will not necessarily win us a wide readership.
I think we need a Nobel Prize winner or two, and that will help us tremendously. I mean, the Poles have Olga Tokarczuk. They also had Miloš and a bunch of other people who did rise to fame. So I think we just didn't have a chance to be there on that level. And I'm not talking about the level of mastery, I'm simply talking about the level of visibility. And I have to agree with Oksana that the publishing process is extremely complicated. When we discuss this, we cannot let that not be a factor. We have to take it into account. I've heard that, for example, if you publish a novel, you have to secure a review of that novel to be published in a good magazine like a lay review of books or something, and the line is 2 years. So basically, do not publish a novel for the next 2 years. You secure that spot in line, and you have to publish the novel when that spot in line is, coming closer, so that the review will appear immediately after the book is released, or the galley of the book is released or whatnot. Because otherwise, yes, the book is published, but it is not being noticed. And that just means we have to work harder on advertising and work collectively, not just each author for themselves, but publishers, translators, publicists, people who write reviews, people who perhaps have connections in the publishing world, so that we could at least secure, some visibility to at least some works, and then hopefully that process will take root.
Thank you. A question from Brett Osler. Did your experience in the bordering states inspire any writing? And if so, what were the themes and emotions that were explored? I'm not sure what he means by bordering states, whether it's referring to the travels that you were in the nomadic life that you were
right.
Or...
Yeah, for me, it definitely was very inspirational. I have poems in the new collection that I'm just finalizing. I have poems about Vienna in connection to Eros and civilization, and kind of waves of destruction and then restoration that happen in these kinds of contexts. And I have, it's not a bordering state, but we did spend quite a bit of time in the Black Forest. This past year, my husband had a fellowship there, and what fascinated me about it, or what kind of brought it home to me, was that 120 Days of Sodom by de Sade was set in a castle in the Black Forest as well, just about 2 or 3 hours from where we lived. And rereading it and looking at parts of it brought it home to me also, to what extent the current war is actually the enactment of that volume, the entrapment of people in the occupied territories, in these cellars where their bodies are just playthings of the Russian soldiers, and all of the most terrible things you can think of are going to happen to these human bodies without any kind of constraint or any kind of law or any kind of really consequence. Not even words remain quite often. So in some ways, writing work about this is at least filling in the silence that often reigns after these atrocities are committed. And the point is to do it somehow sensitively and respectfully, and that's very hard, because you're speaking on behalf of somebody else, or after the other person had lost their agency and their voice. So yeah, I think for me, place is really important because it kind of crystallizes the cultural context that emerged in the place that may still be reverberating today and informing not just culture, but also illuminating human behavior and the patterns of human behavior in these very radical liminal situations.
Would you like to add anything, Oksana?
Yeah. Oh, just a few words. I do think that place matters to me immensely as well. I also think that this will become more and more so the experience of many in Ukraine because of how many people were displaced or were forced to travel or immigrate. Perhaps it is also the world's situation right now. Like every eighth person on this planet is a refugee or an immigrant right now. It's a huge new migration of people. And this means this will affect literature very much. What used to be just some kind of like an exotic genre, perhaps at first, immigrant literature and so on, I think it will become so much more extreme in the years to come.
Thank you both. Kasia Williams comments, wonderful poems, reflections and discussion. Thank you so much. Svetlana Lavchkina writes, a beautiful visceral pendulum of the two poet namesakes. Thank you for this experience. Svetlana also asks the same question that Alessandra did about whether translating more classic Ukrainian literature might help with the problem that you were discussing. But Svetlana also asks, what is the ratio in your writer role models between Ukrainian and international?
Meaning, what are our, so to say, favorite writers or people we look up to as figures, as literary figures, perhaps?
And what kind of mix?
What kind of mix?
In Ukrainian and from elsewhere.
I think at this point, for me, it would probably be about the same, equal, especially considering that many Ukrainian writers have risen to some international situation. I don't know if we should call it fame or how we should call it, but definitely being known. So if I'm thinking about Oksana Zabushko, Andriy Kurkov. So, but it's also, the figure of a writer is primarily the texts. So I suppose Svetlana maybe asks about that too, like whose texts are important to me as a writer, people whose work I read. And here I should also say that it's very much two spheres that at this point are equally important. The more I learn about the writing of the world, the more I want to learn about the writing of Ukraine, the more I realize how little I know about, Ukraine. We imagine that just by virtue of coming from that country, we know everything. But then every day I, return to our classics and read and reread them. So, yeah, so I would say that's definitely a process of discovery into both of these spheres.
Oksana Maksymchuk.
For me, I read a lot of Ukrainian language poetry and not as much of the non-poetry. But I read a lot of fiction in English. So I would say that my primary focus in fiction is English language writing or writing that had been translated into English. And that maybe hasn't always been true, but if you look at any other context, there are very few literatures, maybe German literature that I know, or classical literature, because I was trained as an ancient Greek scholar, that I know better than Ukrainian. So Ukrainian literature is still very much focal for me.
Thank you. A question from Kyle Swain. I wonder if you can talk about writing as a witness. And Kyle writes, as someone who writes about the war, I often write with a sense of guilt, as if I'm stealing words from others. You have touched on this a little bit already, but is there anything you would like to add?
It reminds me of a discussion that I read online via Ukrainian social media. Discussion involved many of my friends. Basically, one person wrote poetry that seemed like the poetry of witnessing, and then another person called them on not being a witness, because this person was not really a soldier, but was writing as if they were a soldier, was not really a person grieving because of the loss of a loved one, but wrote as if they lost someone. And the discussion that ensued was very passionate, I should say. Some people said that writer has the right to do it and should not feel guilt because that's how the whole world literature was created, basically. Other people said that perhaps you should, but not right now and not on social media. That kind of creates this effect of immediacy, as if something just happened to the person and people start, empathizing and saying that, they're sorry for their loss and so on and so forth. So I don't think there is a good answer to this question other than everything is contextual. I think every stand that a writer takes is legitimate, but whether it's appropriate in a particular context, that's a different thing. Like perhaps not on social media, but as a book, I think that's okay.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's very controversial. And again, we could just have a discussion for an hour and a half about this, what it means. I think all writing involves guilt and shame. Even when I'm writing poems about experiences I have had, there is necessarily going to be guilt and shame just because I survived them, unlike other people. And I think it's important to be very conscious of what you're a witness to and what it is that you're witnessing, and to thematize it. So if you are not in a certain situation, maybe you should think twice about writing from the first person perspective as if you were in that situation. But again, a lot of literature is produced by people who have not been who have not experienced situations. And Toni Morrison's advice was actually write about what you don't know, write about the things that you didn't experience. But at the same time, you also have to be careful about not speaking for people who usually don't get to speak for themselves when they do want to speak for themselves. So you don't want to kind of displace and overshadow the voices that are trying to be heard, but because you're in a privileged position to be heard, your voice will be the one that will be picked. So I've seen a lot of poetry about war in Ukraine, for instance, being published in the US journals, while poems by Ukrainian authors who have had those experiences are not being published, even though they're being submitted. So you have to kind of, I don't know, it's very ad hoc and you have to navigate it delicately. And I think writing out of the moment of the crisis when a lot of attention is being paid for it to it is quite different again than writing about it 5 years down the road, for instance, when you're no longer really harvesting the benefits of attention, when you're actually empathetically engaging in the situation. So there is no clear recipe, but there are various considerations that I think a person who is trying to write either false or authentic poetry of witness should be tracking.
Thank you so much. We've actually come to the end of our time. We do have one last question that perhaps might be a nice one to end on. I'm conscious that you've both already given so much to us this evening. So let's just perhaps just very quick answers to this question from Diana Ramsey, who also says, thank you for this wonderful discussion. When you read aloud a poem that's being translated into English and that you originally wrote in Ukrainian, does the experience feel different? from reading it aloud in Ukrainian? Do you feel a sense of reconnection or distance from a poem in translation?
I'm afraid I write very simple poems in very simple language, and I'm not too attached to American tradition of poetry writing at this point. So I usually don't. It feels like mine, but a different thing happens when I read prose, my own fiction that was translated by the wonderful Nina Murray or any other translator. Yeah, that often feels kind of different. That feels like it's not my text and I don't recognize it, but in a good way. It feels somewhat, I do feel that difference there.
Oksana Maksymchuk.
Well, I don't really have my work translated very much, but I do a lot of translation, and the translations that I read of other people, to me, are definitely always very different poems that I wrote on their behalf. So I would be surprised if they didn't experience at least some alienation from these texts because they have been reconstituted in a different language and tradition. And so if it were done for me, I would expect something similar, that these are not really my works, but maybe collaborative hybrid works that somebody else has produced with me.
Thank you so
Thank you
much
for these questions.
Thank you for the questions. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of the audience. And thank you once again to all three speakers for such a wonderful start to this webinar series. We'll be sending out an email to everybody who signed up with information about whether or not we'll be publishing the recording and about the next webinars in the series. The next one will take place on 29th of May, if I'm not mistaken. Is that just... anyway, we will send an email to confirm that in case I have that date wrong. And we very much hope to see everybody there if you can make it. So thank you once again, Oksana and Marko.
Thank you. This was
Thank
a
you
pleasure.
so much. Yeah. Oksana and Julie and Marko, this has been amazing. And thank you so much to the audience for these beautiful questions. And to Olga and Mark for joining us, for being available in case of a disaster.
Yes, I'm very grateful to everyone who made this possible, and to Marko for the wonderful moderation, and to Oksana for reading alongside with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.